Welcome to Geekstorians, the show where we sift through a century of geek culture and try to understand how a handful of strange little hobbies became the backbone of modern imagination. I'm Dave from Geektown, and today we're looking at something that isn't a film, or a toy, or a convention, or a technology, but a language. Something fans built between themselves without even realising they were doing it. Over this season, we've seen fandom invent magazines, build clubs, crash into moral panics, reshape entire industries, and argue about what counts more enthusiastically than some governments debate budgets. But underneath all of that, there was always this secret code, a way of talking and winking and signalling, "You're one of us." Today, we're not telling the story of fandom itself. We're telling the story of how fans learnt to speak. This is the secret language of fandom. It starts with a letter, a cheap sheet of pulp paper posted sometime around 1930, addressed to the editor of Amazing Stories. The letter itself isn't remarkable. The vocabulary is. Words that don't exist anywhere else. Acronyms no dictionary recognises. Half jokes, half complaints. Fully incomprehensible to anyone who hasn't been following the argument for the last 6 issues. Things like Circon, short for serious and constructive, which in early sci-fi fandoms was occasionally an insult. Or Gaffia, meaning getting away from it all. Coined by fans who were so buried in correspondence and amateur journalism that escaping into real life felt exotic. These weren't official terms. No committee invented them. No style guide approved them. Fans just made them up because they needed them. This was the early friction of a community trying to communicate faster than the world around it. Postal mail was slow, printing was slow, so language sped up instead. Soon readers recognised each other by the words they used. Shared slang, shared jokes, shared grumbles about editors and postage costs. It wasn't just vocabulary, it was a password. And little did they know those strange little words, scratched out in letters and fanzines, were the beginning of something much bigger. A century-long tradition of fans inventing new ways to say, "I get that reference, I speak your language, you're one of us." Today we call that geek culture. Back then, it was just communication. And that was only the beginning. Because once fans had started making up their own words, they were only a breath away from inventing symbols, signs, gestures, codes, and eventually a language spoken across the world. If you want to understand how geeks learnt to talk, properly talk, not just write angry letters about Martian physics, you have to start with early science fiction fans. Because they didn't just read stories, they read each other. In early fandom, anything that happened inside that world, the jokes, the arguments, the traditions, were described as fanish, meaning of fandom, not mundane and not especially interested in impressing the outside world. Every issue of Amazing Stories carried a miniature social network tucked in the back pages. Letters printed with names, ages, hometowns, addresses, and before long, patterns. A shared way of speaking. Not grand literary flourishes, not quotes from stories themselves. Tiny things. Little linguistic shortcuts that bubbled up simply because early fans were writing to each other constantly. More frequently, in some cases, than they were writing to their own families. It turns out that when you put passionate, argumentative, wildly imaginative people into a closed conversation loop, they invent jargon faster than bacteria divide. And crucially, this jargon didn't come from the writers, it came from the readers. One of the first people to realise something unusual was happening was Jack Spear, a fan with a talent for organisation and an unusual tolerance for chaos. Spear was part amateur historian, part accidental anthropologist, and part organisational menace. In 1939, he looked at the rapidly growing stew of fan slang and thought, this needs a guidebook. So he wrote one. He called it Fancyclopedia. Not an encyclopedia about fandom, but an encyclopedia written by fandom for fandom. cataloguing the strange little words fans were inventing to describe themselves and each other. Every in-joke, every abbreviation, every quarrelsome little definition argued over in the letters column. No one had asked for this, but fans absolutely loved it. Yay! Because for the first time, their messy, evolving, disorganized inside language had been written down. It wasn't a rulebook, it was a map, a snapshot of fandom talking to itself, informal, inward-facing, and unconcerned with how it looked from the outside world. And the moment fans saw that improvised vocabulary treated like something worth documenting, it exploded. New slang erupted, old slang mutated. Fans started inventing terms just to see if it might make it into the next edition. Early fan language wasn't about gatekeeping, it wasn't a test, it was a handshake. Take gaffia, short for getting away from it all, a term fans use to describe stepping back from fandom, sometimes quietly and sometimes very, very loudly. Gaffia wasn't just a break, it was often a performance, traditionally involving a dramatic exit, a final fanzine full of grievances, and a strong implication that this time you really meant it. Until, of course, you came back. And fandom being fandom borrowed a perfectly respectable French word for that. You became a revenant. Then there's BNF, Big Name Fan. Originally coined as satire, a gentle mockery of fans who took themselves a bit too seriously, before being enthusiastically adopted as a genuine badge of honour. Not something you could claim for yourself, of course. Doing that invited immediate and merciless ridicule. And then there's Circon, short for serious and constructive, which began life as a jibe at fans who treated science fiction like a solemn civic duty, before gradually softening into a neutral and occasionally affectionate label. In true fanish fashion, it even picked up a second meaning decades later, a tongue-in-cheek euphemism for getting stoned at conventions. Usually followed by very serious conversations about nothing in particular. These weren't just shortcuts, they were cultural markers, ways of signalling tone, intent, belonging. Like patches on a denim jacket or stickers on a laptop, or a knowing nod when someone quotes a line you thought only you remembered. And that was the real magic, because long before fans had conventions, long before they had proper clubs, newsletters or tape trading circles, long before chat rooms and forums and memes, they had language, a shared vocabulary that made strangers feel like friends and friends feel like community. And those early fans, mostly teenagers with cheap paper and cheap stamps, had no idea that tiny linguistic snowball they were rolling was about to gather speed. Because the next time fans met each other, it wasn't in print, it was in person. And that's when shared language became something even more powerful, a secret code you could recognise across a crowded room. When the first fans stepped into the first proto-conventions, they weren't walking into a slick event hall with cosplay competitions, functioning air conditioning, and someone dressed as a 7-foot Wookiee trying not to knock over the merchandise stand. They were walking into a room, usually a municipal room, with chairs and a worrying smell of varnish. It was the 1930s. The concept of geek culture didn't exist yet. But awkward teenagers attempting conversation, that was absolutely in full bloom. These were kids who had spent years writing letters to each other, building tiny friendships in the back pages of amazing stories. They recognised each other's names, but not each other's faces. Which is a fun social experiment when you think about it. Imagine stepping into a hall full of strangers and trying to guess who looks like someone who would write a letter passionately defending Martian Canal irrigation.
That guy.
So fans bought clues. Badges became a kind of social shorthand, a way of saying this is who I am without risking conversation. These were scrappy cardboard circles with handwritten club initials like SFL for Science Fiction League, which sounds imposing until you realise that most of these club chapters were 3 kids in a garage with a mimeograph machine. Fans compared badges the way naturalists compared beetles. Oh, you're in the Brooklyn chapter. My condolences. I hear their meetings run long and their arguments run very long. There were also name tags, not mass-produced ones, but homemade, occasionally decorated with tiny rocket doodles or alien faces that look like potatoes with antennae. These weren't just identifiers, they were conversation starters. And conversation did definitely need starting. One early attendee described Worldcon 1939 as half excitement, half competitive shyness. Everyone desperately wanted to talk, but nobody wanted to be the first to reveal they had brought 2 notebooks of spaceship designs just in case. And then came the moment that fandom mythologizes. Forrest J. Ackerman walking into Worldcon 1939 dressed head to toe in shimmering silver lame. The very first recorded fan costume, designed and sewn by his partner Myrtle R. Morijo Douglas. They didn't just show up in something that would eventually become cosplay. They showed up speaking a visual dialect that nobody had seen before. Their costume said, loudly and wordlessly, "I don't just read the magazine, I live in the magazine." This was the birth of a new dialect, visual quoting. Cosplay wasn't just dress up, it was communication. A costume broadcast your fandom, your tribe, your reference points, your literary taste. Also your sewing skills and your willingness to wear a cape on public transport. But fans immediately started picking up the language. Buttons with slogans, tiny hand-drawn rocket symbols, homemade brooches shaped like planets, badges that said "I like Asimov" in capital letters, not as an argument, just as a deeply held personal truth. The Futurans chapter, that wonderfully chaotic faction of early fandom, even had their own body language, which mostly consisted of leaning aggressively across tables, arguing about socialism, and occasionally getting thrown out for being too enthusiastic about science fiction and politics. Read the room, guys. But the real comedy gold comes from the early verbal shorthand being spoken out loud for the first time. Imagine someone saying "circon" out loud, a word that's used mostly in print, and half the room nodding like they're fluent while the other half pretends they are. It was the original version of pretending you'd seen a show you absolutely haven't. People would introduce themselves as BNF, big name fan, sometimes as a joke, sometimes as irony, and sometimes because they hadn't yet realised that saying that about yourself would get you mercilessly mocked. Every fandom was basically a room full of people finding out in real time what their inside jokes sounded like. But for people who'd never been in a room full of like-minded weirdos, and people who'd been the only sci-fi reader in their entire neighbourhood, these tiny signals, these badges, slang words and silver lame jumpsuits, they were magic. Instant connection, instant belonging. A secret handshake made out of stickers, doodles and half-invented vocabulary. It was the first time fans discovered the power of recognising each other through code, spoken, written or worn. And that instinct, that signal and response became part of the foundation of geek culture. It was only going to spread. If early conventions gave geek culture its first physical signals, the decades that followed gave it a dialect. Long before the internet, fans were building a whole communication ecosystem out of paper, photocopiers, overheard jokes, and whatever stationery they could afford that month. And it began with the fanzine explosion. The 1940s through to the 1960s were basically the Renaissance, if the Renaissance had been powered by teenagers with typewriters and too many opinions. Zines multiplied like tribbles. Everyone had one. Some people had 4. Many featured arguments so heated they were followed by handwritten apologies squeezed into the margins like emotional post-it notes. Each zine, each APA, Amateur Press Association, basically a paper-based group chat, had its own tone, its own slang, and its own rhythm. Some used circon as praise, others used it as a warning. Zines developed their own slang, words like fanak, ego boo, and lock, alongside in-jokes and assumptions about what they thought everybody else already knew. Fandom wasn't just using language, it was breeding it. And then came comic shops. If conventions were linguistic laboratories, comic shops were dialect training centres. This is where terms like mint, near mint, reader copy, variant cover and bagged and boarded escaped from dealer shorthand and became everyday fan vocabulary. You could walk into any comic shop in the world by the 1970s, say the words long box and instantly earn a nod of recognition. The universal salute of, you too have spent afternoons sitting on the floor organising your collection by writer, artist, imprint and a system only you understand. Meanwhile, across the 60s and 70s, something else was happening. The rise of quotable culture. Not written language this time, spoken language. And it didn't come from nowhere. Radio comedy had already trained audiences to remember strange phrases. Shows like The Goon Show taught listeners that repetition, rhythm, and delivery mattered as much as meaning. Television took that instinct and amplified it. It turned culture into a shared timetable. Millions of people watching the same jokes, the same sketches, the same episodes at the same time, and then repeating them the next day. For the first time, fandom had a common spoken reference point. Suddenly, geek identity wasn't just badges and zines, it was dialect. And when things like Monty Python arrived, it hit fandom like a linguistic supernova. Suddenly, people weren't introducing themselves. They were shouting, "Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. 'Tis but a scratch. He's not the Messiah. He's a very naughty boy," across student unions and convention halls. It was a communal code, instant bonding, and occasionally very confusing for bystanders. Then came The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which moved effortlessly from radio to book to television, carrying its language with it. Don't panic. So long and thanks for all the fish. And the wonderfully useless declaration, or useful depending on your point of view, 42. By the late 70s and early 80s, that style of communication had spread. Doctor Who, Star Trek, Blake Seven, Red Dwarf. Quoting wasn't just something fans did, it was how they recognised each other. Geek culture had become a quoting culture, a conversational sport where the challenge wasn't just to recognise the reference, but replying with a deeper cut. This was where the call and response aspect of geek language really solidified. You'd shout a line, somebody across a cafeteria would shout the next line. Friendships formed, sometimes romance, occasionally lifelong grudges where somebody misquoted Red Dwarf. Absolute smegheads. And then there were the arcades, bright, loud, and public. Arcades gave geek culture a new kind of language, not just spoken but physical. You learned it by watching, by listening, by standing slightly too close to someone far better than you and pretending not to stare at their hands. Words flew around the room, quarter up, cheese, scrub, tilt. Short terms, barked quickly, understood instantly. And suddenly you could identify your tribe without saying a word, just by how they held the joystick, how hard they mashed the buttons, how creatively they swore at a CRT screen. And if somebody leaned in and whispered, up, up, down, down, left, right, B, A, it didn't need explaining, you already knew. The language had become muscle memory. As games moved into bedrooms and living rooms, something else happened. The shouting stopped, but the language didn't. Home gaming taught fans to talk in systems, in levels, in lives, in retries. Problems weren't failures anymore, they were runs, attempts, something you reset and tried again. Secrets were shared quietly, cheat codes scribbled on scraps of paper, maps drawn from memory, knowledge passed hand to hand like contraband. And that idea that the system mattered as much as beating it was about to spread much further. Because then came the biggest analog leap of all. Tabletop role-playing games. Dungeons & Dragons didn't just create adventures, it created a lexicon. Words like campaign, crit, saving throw, dungeon crawl, NPC, terms that didn't exist before suddenly existed everywhere. Players didn't just use them at the table, they carried them into real life. I rolled a natural 20 on my maths test. I failed my charisma check. I need a long rest before Monday. Parents heard this and assumed it was something to do with drug culture. It wasn't. Well, mostly it wasn't. Tabletop gaming also invented a very particular tone of voice. The polite argument disguised as rule clarification. Actually, technically, as written, no, Gary did not intend that. Yes, he did. It's right here. This was geek language at its purest. Enthusiastic disagreement performed with absolute sincerity and the confidence that somewhere the rulebook would back you up. By the end of the 1980s, geek culture had a fully formed analog dialect. It was spoken across conventions, comic shops, gaming tables, arcades, university clubs, and late-night living rooms filled with VHS tapes and questionable snacks. You could recognize another fan by the way they talked, the jokes they made, the references they dropped, even the way they described real-world problems using game mechanics. This was a living language, but analog language has limits. You can only travel as far as a photocopier, a postal service, or somebody yelling "Khan" loud enough for strangers to answer back. If geek culture was going to become global, it needed a new medium, a faster one that could spread slang and symbols at the speed of electricity. And it arrived with a sound. The world's first digital dialect was about to begin. If analog fandom gave geek culture a shared dialect, the early internet did something far more dangerous. It let everyone reply instantly. And suddenly the pause that had once saved arguments, the wait for the letter, a zine, or a convention, was gone. The modem didn't just connect fans to bulletin boards and early university networks. It connected them to each other, live, unfiltered, and thinking faster than they could type. And that meant the language of geekdom had to evolve immediately. Because text, it turns out, is terrible at conveying tone. Sarcasm looks like sincerity. Jokes look like insults. Arguments escalate accidentally. So fans did what fans had always done. They hacked a solution. In 1982, at Carnegie Mellon University, a professor named Scott Fahlman was watching an online discussion collapse under the weight of misunderstood jokes. So he suggested a fix, a simple one, a sideways smile. A way to say, this is friendly, this is a joke, please don't write a 3-page rebuttal. It worked. The emoticon was born. Almost instantly, people expanded the idea. Not just a smile, but a bigger smile, a grin, a wink, a confused face, a frown, a cheerful, almost aggressively optimistic expression that suggested nothing bad could possibly be happening. All built out of punctuation, all sideways, all somehow universally understood. For the first time, emotion had been compressed into text, and geeks ran with it. Then came the art. Not paintings, not drawings, art made entirely out of letters, numbers, and symbols. ASCII art. Fans spent hours crafting dragons, starships, dungeon maps, entire fantasy scenes, all using nothing but a keyboard and stubborn determination. Your signature wasn't just your name anymore, it was your calling card. Some were elegant, some were enormous, some were so wide they broke people's screens and triggered polite but firm complaints. This was visual language again, just like the costumes at Worldcon or badges or buttons, only now it travelled at the speed of electricity. And then there was Usenet. If bulletin boards were small villages, Usenet was a sprawling, argumentative continent. This was where fandom truly went global. People debated science fiction, comics, games, films, and television with strangers thousands of miles away, often at great length and rarely with restraint. Usenet gave us a whole new category of speech. A flame, an angry reply written with the enthusiasm of somebody who had waited all day to be right, which often led to flame wars. A troll, someone who posts something provocative and then quietly leaves to make a cup of tea while the chaos unfolds. The phrase, read the manual, often preceded an adjective that suggested the writer had lost patience several replies ago. And the FAQ, the frequently asked questions document, lovingly written, thoughtfully, and almost never consulted by the people who actually need it most. Usenet also invented how we quote each other online. Lines stacked on lines, replies nested inside replies, the visible skeleton of conversation building up post by post. It was initially somewhat messy and sometimes confusing, but it was glorious. And then came the acronyms. Lots of acronyms. So many acronyms. Because once fans realized they could compress entire sentences into a few letters, there was no going back. People stopped typing "in my opinion" and started typing IMO. I'll be right back, BRB. Laughing out loud, which, in a delightful twist of history, originally actually meant lots of luck, before being repurposed by people laughing alone at their keyboards. These shortcuts escaped their original habitats. They slipped from message boards into emails, from emails into chat rooms, from chat rooms into everyday speech. Suddenly people were saying things like, "I'm AFK for lunch," out loud, and everybody knew exactly what that meant. And then something quietly profound happened. For the first time in history, fans across the world were speaking the same language at the same time. The same shorthand, the same jokes, the same references, the same emotional cues built out of nothing but text and timing. A global dialect, not owned by a country, not taught in schools. Created collaboratively by people who just wanted to talk about the things that they loved, faster, clearer, and with fewer accidental arguments. The internet didn't invent geek language. Geek language shaped the internet. And once that happened, once the world learned to speak like the network fans had built, that language stopped being niche and started becoming normal. Because the moment fans learnt how to talk online, they were ready to play together, in real time. And that was going to change everything. There's a moment in every subculture's life when you realise something has changed. The thing that you used to have to explain first, the reference you once tested carefully before using, the words that only made sense to your people, suddenly didn't need translating. For geek language, that moment arrived in the late 90s and early 2000s. Not because everybody suddenly became a fan, but because everyone suddenly started talking like one. And the biggest leak didn't come from TV or film, it came from games. Video games had spent decades quietly building up their own vocabulary, precise, mechanical, and brutally efficient. Language designed for systems, rules, progress, and failure. But then games stopped becoming solitary. They went online. MMOs, multiplayer shooters, shared servers. Suddenly people weren't just playing together, they were talking together in real time, at speed, and often while yelling. That's when game language escaped the screen. People started saying things like, "I'm trying to level up at work. This task is such a grind." They really nerfed that feature. We're stuck in a boss fight with this project. Words like noob, aggro, camping, gank, farming slipped into everyday conversation, sometimes jokingly, sometimes not. These weren't punchlines, they were metaphors, efficient ones. Gaming language had a brutal honesty about effort, repetition, risk, and reward. It described modern life better than corporate jargon ever could. You didn't need to explain what grinding felt like. Everyone already knew. And then came the phone, specifically texting. Early SMS messages weren't poetic, they were expensive. You didn't pay per message, you paid per character in some cases. And also, if you're under 25, here's the part that makes sound a bit like folklore. You didn't have a full keyboard, you only had letters buried under the 9 number keys. So to get one letter, you press the same button multiple times. 3 presses for a C, 4 for an S. It was slow, expensive, and infuriating to write and send a text. So people did what geeks had always done under pressure. They optimized language. See you later became CUL8R. Before became B4. Vowels were optional. Grammar was negotiable. Punctuation was a luxury item. LOL, short for laughing out loud, escaped the internet and walked straight into everyone's pockets. This wasn't laziness, it was efficiency. An entire generation learned to compress meaning into the smallest possible space, not unlike fitting a game into a limited memory or a program into a few precious kilobytes. Geek language had always thrived under constraint. SMS just forced everybody else to learn it. Then that texting language fed back into the internet, chat rooms, instant messages, forums, early social platforms. And suddenly the language fans had been refining for decades became the default way people communicated. Shortened phrases, shared references, irony as punctuation. And then came the memes. Not jokes, not pictures. Memes are compressed culture. One image, one phrase, an entire conversation implied. A meme didn't work because of the picture, it worked because everyone understood the context. It was fanish language logic, scaled to the whole internet. Even workplaces started to change. As computers moved from specialized tools to everyday necessities, people began talking about work the way geeks had always talked about systems. Projects had bugs, updates became patches, products launched in versions, deadlines slipped because something wasn't ready for release. Office meetings started sounding suspiciously like patch notes. Nobody stopped to ask where the language had come from, it just worked. And that's how you know a dialect has won. The language geeks built to find each other, to explain imaginary worlds, impossible systems and invented rules, turned out to be perfect for explaining real life. Not because it was trendy, but because it was clear. Effort, progress, failure, iteration, reward. Geek language didn't take over the world quietly adopted it. And once everyone was speaking it, geek culture stopped being a subculture. It became infrastructure. Across this season, we've talked about a lot of things. Magazines stapled in bedrooms, rebels turning comics into an art form, videotapes passed hand by hand, tabletop games accused of summoning demons, television shows saved by fans who refused to let them die, the internet arriving like a thunderclap and never really stopping. But underneath all of it, every era, every panic, every breakthrough, there was something quieter working. People talking. Sometimes slowly by post, sometimes loudly in convention halls, sometimes obsessively in comic shops and arcades, sometimes at 3 a.m, hunched over a keyboard. Fans didn't just consume culture, they discussed it, argued about it, joked about it, built shared shorthand around it. They invented ways to say, I love this, I know this, I belong here. And those ways mattered because language wasn't decoration. It was the tool that made fandom possible at all. Not with manifestos, not with rules, with language. Every acronym, every in-joke, every misquoted line shouted across a room, every term that started as nonsense and became universal. Those were connective threads, a way to recognize each other across distance, across time, across changing technology. That's why geek culture survived things that should have killed it. The moral panics, the cancellations, the industry collapses, the formats that vanished overnight. Because culture isn't just stored in objects, it's carried in conversations, in habits, in people. And once you see it that way, the story of fandom stops being a collection of hobbies and starts looking like a long-running dialogue, one that's been going on for more than a century. Today, that language is everywhere. You hear it in offices, in schools, in headlines, in casual conversations between people who've never owned a comic or rolled a dice in their lives. But it didn't start there. It started with people who felt a little out of step with the world around them, who built their own vocabulary to explain the things they loved. And in doing so, quietly changed how the rest of us talk about imagination, effort, failure, progress, and joy. This season has been the story of how fandom was born, not just as a group of people, but as a culture, one with its own rituals, its own arguments, its own history, and its own voice. And maybe that's the quiet lesson hiding in all of this. When people take the time to really understand each other, to learn the language, the references, the shorthand, communities don't just survive, they grow into something wonderful. I'm Dave from Geektown, and this has been Geekstorians. If you've enjoyed this journey through the strange, messy, and brilliant history of geek culture, I really appreciate it if you could rate, review, or subscribe wherever you're listening. It genuinely helps more people discover the show. You can also leave comments over at geektown.co.uk or share your thoughts on social media. I'd love to hear what you made of Season 1, what worked, what surprised you, and what stories you'd like us to explore next. As you may have gathered, this episode brings Season 1 to a close. All 10 episodes plus the Christmas special are now live and ready to binge in whatever order you feel most fanish. We will be taking a short break now, but Geekstorians will definitely be back for Season 2 with a whole new set of defining geek stories. More on that very, very soon. In the meantime, you'll find more from us over at geektown.co.uk alongside news, reviews, and the latest UK and US TV premiere dates. And if you fancy even more geeky goodness each week, there's also Geektown Radio, our regular show covering TV, film, and gaming, and the stories behind the stories. Wherever you are and whatever language you speak, fictional, fanish, or freshly invented, thanks for being part of the conversation. We'll see you next time, here on Geekstorians.